Harper Ellis never imagined that the most beautiful day of her life would become the one she'd want to forget forever. A promising young editor at a major publishing house in Manhattan, she had spent over a year planning her wedding to Nathan Cooper, a renowned neurosurgeon she had loved since college. They were the perfect couple in the eyes of friends, family, and social media. Beautiful, accomplished, and seemingly destined for each other. The wedding took place at a luxurious hotel overlooking Central Park, where crystal chandeliers sparkled above tables adorned with pristine white flowers. Harper, dressed in her custom-made gown, stepped out of the bridal suite with a heart pounding and tears of joy threatening to spill. Everything was flawless, from the soft piano playing to the vintage champagne, and hundreds of guests waited to witness the moment Harper would walk toward the man of her dreams. But as the doors to the grand ballroom opened and she began her walk down the petal-strewn aisle, the only thing she saw on Nathan's face was emptiness. No smile, no emotion, just a cold, unfamiliar stare. Halfway down the aisle, Harper sensed something was wrong. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, as if someone had just whispered an unspeakable truth. Then, just as all eyes turned toward the radiant bride, Nathan stepped forward, his voice trembling yet firm. "I can't do this, Harper. I'm sorry. I'm in love with someone else." The room seemed to collapse into a void. Harper froze. Nathan looked away, unable to meet her gaze, and just behind him stood Lauren, Harper's closest friend, silent, but with a look in her eyes that wasn't guilt, it was confirmation. Harper stood there, a bride without a groom, surrounded by clicking cameras, pitying stares, and the first crack in a heart that would never be the same again. Harper stood frozen, her legs stiff, her hands trembling around the bouquet now slipping from her grasp. Everything around her blurred into a surreal nightmare. The murmurs, the blinding flashes, the judgmental stares from once familiar faces. The world seemed to dissolve right in front of her. And then, a voice cut through the silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that silenced the entire room. And that's enough. All heads turned. At the far end of the aisle stood a man, tall, composed in a charcoal suit with a face recognizable to anyone who read business magazines. Ethan Marlowe, CEO of Marlowe & Co., one of the most powerful men on Wall Street. No one understood why he was there. Ethan wasn't family, he wasn't even on the guest list. But no one dared stop him as he stepped past the rows of stunned guests, walking toward Harper with unwavering purpose and a gaze carved in steel. When he reached her, he removed his overcoat and gently draped it over her bare, trembling shoulders. "Let's go," he said quietly, only for her to hear. No questions, no demands, just a silent gesture of calm strength. Harper looked into his steely gray eyes, filled not with pity, but certainty. There was something in that gaze that made her let the bouquet fall to the floor and nod slowly. Ethan extended his hand. Harper placed hers into it. They walked out together, through a sea of stunned silence, past the fallen petals and stilled guests. A procession not of celebration, but of unexpected rescue. And perhaps of something just beginning. Harper couldn't quite remember how she had left the hotel. It was all a blur. The snap of her heels against the cobblestone sidewalk, her cold hand cradled in his, the soft click of the car door, and the Manhattan lights streaming past the window like a river of unending motion. By the time the numbness in her chest began to fade, the car had pulled up in front of a high-rise building on the Upper East Side. A doorman opened the door immediately, greeted Ethan by name, and politely avoided eye contact with the trembling bride wrapped in his coat. The penthouse was perched at the top of the building, quiet, spacious, and so perfectly arranged that Harper felt like an intruder. Dark tones, clean lines, expensive taste. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a city burning in golden light. No family photos, no personal clutter. Everything was too pristine and far too lonely. Ethan didn't say much. He handed her a glass of water, placed a soft blanket on the edge of the sofa, and spoke in his low, steady voice. You can stay here tonight. Don't worry about anything. Just rest." Harper tried to find words to thank him, but her throat tightened. Instead, she gave a faint nod, her eyes swollen and heavy with unshed tears. Ethan left the room, his footsteps fading into the quiet, a silence that didn't sting like the one at the altar, but rather wrapped around her like a distant embrace, like a quiet message saying, "You don't have to go through this alone." Harper stepped toward the window, quietly gazing out at the garden bathed in the light of the setting sun. Somewhere in the city, the wedding guests were surely still whispering about that humiliating scene. Her phone, left behind at the church, was probably overflowing with missed calls and messages. But here, in this room, Harper found something she hadn't expected: silence. Not the kind that carried shame anymore, but a strange kind of peace. She wondered, in all honesty, what did Ethan Marlowe really want from her? No one offers help that generously without expecting something in return, especially not a man known for never doing anything without a purpose, like Ethan. And yet, tonight, Harper decided not to think about it. Tomorrow would be a new day, a day when she'd have to face the consequences of everything that had happened and the mysterious man who had pulled her out of hell. The next morning, Harper woke to the pale sunlight filtering through the tall glass windows. The living room was still and quiet, save for the distant hum of a city waking up. She sat up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, and noticed her wedding dress, neatly folded and placed beside the couch like a memory carefully put away. On the table sat a steaming cup of coffee and a handwritten note. "I have a morning meeting. Eat something when you wake. E.M." Ethan didn't return until late afternoon. When he walked in, the energy of the room shifted subtly. Still impeccably dressed, yet his eyes no longer held the same distance. There was calculation in them now, and something else Harper couldn't name. He invited her to sit. "I have a proposition," he said, his voice direct. "I need a companion for social events over the next few months. Someone poised, trustworthy, and not used to playing pretend." Harper frowned. "What exactly are you saying?" "I want to hire you," he stated. "No intimacy expected, no obligations beyond attending galas, dinners, launch events with me. In return, I'll cover your living expenses and give you time to decide what comes next for your life." Harper was silent. A part of her found it strange, almost insulting, but another part, the one still crushed by betrayal, saw in this offer something else. A pause. A breathing space in a world that had collapsed around her. "Why me?" she asked softly. Ethan shrugged, his eyes steady. "Because you're not fake, and because I think you need a new beginning, just like I once did." Harper understood. For Ethan, this wasn't just kindness, it was strategy. She considered it carefully. This opportunity gave her time to heal, to rebuild her life, and, though he didn't say it aloud, perhaps reclaim a measure of the dignity she had lost. "What if I refuse?" she asked. "Then I'll help you settle somewhere else and respect your decision," he replied without hesitation. "There are no conditions." Harper looked deep into his eyes. For the first time in months, she felt like she had a choice. "All right," she said slowly, clearly. "I accept your offer, Mr. Marlowe." It took Harper a few days to accept the reality. She was living in the penthouse of a man she barely knew, about to play a role she'd never imagined herself in. The deal with Ethan was clear, emotionless, unbinding, but that didn't make it easier. She didn't know what to say over breakfast, wasn't used to the quietness of a home where everything ran perfectly, where nothing was out of place, but nothing felt warm either. Then, on a Friday afternoon, Carmen, the housekeeper, knocked gently on her door. "Mr. Marlowe requests your company for dinner. There's an event tonight." Harper glanced at the dress laid out on her bed. Simple, elegant, and nothing like what she used to wear. She hesitated, then nodded. Not because of the agreement, but because deep down, she needed to know. Could she still stand before people without falling apart? On the way to the gala, the air inside the car was quiet. Harper could feel every beat of her heart. She had never felt this close to a man, and yet known so little about him. "Remember tonight," Ethan said calmly. "You are not Harper Ellis, the woman who was left at the altar. You are the one standing beside me. And that alone is enough to make people envious." She turned to him, daring to ask, "And what about you? Who are you, really, behind the mask of Ethan Marlowe, the man Manhattan fears?" His gaze paused for a moment, but then he smiled faintly. "That," he said, "is a story for another night." Harper stepped out of the car with Ethan, her hand resting firmly on his arm. Camera flashes exploded all around them, but this time, she didn't feel like prey. She had learned how to stand tall, to smile just enough, not out of fear and not with false humility. "Keep your head high," Ethan leaned in and whispered near her ear. "They're waiting for you to tremble. Don't give them that privilege." She gave a slight nod. Inside, the grand hall was adorned with towering crystal chandeliers and imported fresh flowers. Harper's hand tightened gently around his as she began to recognize familiar faces, people who had been at the wedding that day. And then, as if fate were mocking her, her gaze locked with a couple standing across the ballroom, Nathan and Lauren. Nathan wore a deep navy suit, still with that polished artificial charm. Lauren, in a striking red dress, radiated a mix of unease and forced elegance. Both stared at her in stunned silence, as if they had just seen the ghost of their own conscience. Time stood still. Harper couldn't breathe. But then, a warm hand closed around hers. "Ethan's. Do you want to leave?" he asked softly, his eyes never leaving her face. She took a deep breath. "No," she said firmly, "I'm staying." And in Ethan's gray eyes, something shifted, a flicker of respect. For the first time since they met, she could truly feel it. But no party could go on forever without brushing up against old wounds. When Harper returned from the restroom, Lauren was standing in the side hallway, waiting. "Harper?" Lauren called out, her voice small but clear. "We need to talk." Harper stopped in her tracks. She looked at the woman who had once been like a sister to her, the same woman who had driven invisible knives into her back, not once but many times. Yet now, the pain wasn't the same. There was only a strange kind of emptiness. "There's nothing left to say," Harper replied softly. "I wish you and Nathan happiness, truly." Lauren was stunned, not because of the words, but because they held no venom. She opened her mouth to speak again, but then closed it, lowered her head, and walked away in silence. When Harper returned, Ethan was waiting at the end of the hallway, his eyes questioning. "It's okay," she said, her voice light but resolute. "I don't feel anything. No anger, no regret, not even hate." He looked at her for a long moment, as if seeing the woman before him for the very first time. "That means," he said quietly, "you've started to heal." Harper nodded. "But I didn't do it alone," she whispered. "I had you." And in that moment, without a confession, without a promise, something between them shifted forever. Since that night at the gala, the relationship between Harper and Ethan was no longer the same. It was a quiet evening. Harper and Ethan had just returned from a museum gala. Rain fell softly outside, and they sat in the living room, each with a glass of wine, watching the city lights blur beyond the glass. Harper curled up on the sofa, her hair down, makeup gone. In the soft lighting, she looked delicate and real, like a version of herself she hadn't seen in a long time. Ethan set his glass down, sat in silence for a long while, and then finally spoke. "My sister was left too, right in the middle of her engagement party." Harper looked up. He had never spoken of family before. The words weren't just a confession. They were a scar reopening. "I was in London at the time. She didn't call. She just endured it alone. And that night, she drove in the rain. There was an accident." Ethan didn't cry, but his voice rasped, each word drawn from an old wound that never fully healed. "I promised myself, if I ever saw someone go through that kind of public cruelty again, I wouldn't just stand there." Harper didn't know what to say. She simply placed her hand on his, a small gesture, but more honest than any words. "Thank you for not standing still," she whispered. For the first time, Ethan didn't look away. In those steel-grab eyes, there was something no longer made of logic, but pain and trust. Harper rose on her toes and placed a kiss on his lips, soft, trembling, tentative, but full of trust. For the first time since she'd been left behind, she no longer felt small. And for the first time since his sister's death, Ethan no longer felt alone. The next morning, the soft sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room, still carrying the gentle aftertaste of last night's rain. Harper woke later than usual, but her heart no longer felt burdened by old shadows. She felt lighter, clearer, as if a protective shell inside her had finally fallen away. When she came downstairs to the dining room, Carmen greeted her with a look that was equal parts tender and unreadable. "There's a letter for you," the older woman said, placing a thick ivory envelope on the table. The elegant print on the front read, "Sorbonne Université Paris." Harper froze. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was an official letter of admission, accompanied by a full scholarship for a master's program in Spanish literature. The letter was the final chapter of an old dream she had tucked away in a drawer of memory when she first became engaged to Nathan. Now it had returned, vivid, real, and right on time. Ethan entered the room just as she was finishing the last lines. He wore a black shirt and gray slacks, composed as always, but his eyes immediately caught the shift in her expression. "It's from Paris," she said. "They accepted me and offered a scholarship." Silence hung between them like morning mist. Finally, Ethan stepped closer, meeting her gaze directly. "Then you have to go." Harper looked up. "You don't have to be so noble about this." "I'm not being noble," he replied, his voice lower than usual. "I just don't want to be the reason you don't follow your dream." She looked at him. Part of her understood. Another part of her ached. "And what if I don't want to go?" she asked softly. "Then you'll regret it," he said without hesitation. "Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but someday you'll ask yourself, if I had gone, who might I have become?" Harper folded the letter and placed it gently on the table. "I don't want to choose between you and my dream." "You don't have to," he whispered. "Because I'll wait. If you choose to come back." It wasn't a promise, but it held more weight than any vow they'd ever spoken. 3 days later, Harper signed the acceptance letter. She would fly to Paris at the start of the next month. The final days at the estate passed in a rhythm both quiet and strangely peaceful, though beneath the calm surface flowed 1,000 unsaid feelings. Ethan and Harper still shared dinner each night, still walked through the garden, still talked like longtime lovers, but neither of them spoke of the day she would leave. Until the final night. Ethan had prepared a private dinner beneath the blooming jacaranda tree, Harper's favorite spot. The table was lit with candles, the red wine already poured. "When you go," he said, his voice deep and steady, "live the life you deserve. Don't let anyone, not even me, make you forget that." Harper nodded, her eyes shimmering. "And what if I can't forget you?" He reached out and touched her hand gently. "Then let me be a beautiful part of your journey. And if fate allows, we'll meet again, not as people who owe each other something, but as two souls who choose each other once more." Paris welcomed Harper with a crisp morning breeze, a blue-gray sky, and the faint scent of coffee drifting from sidewalk cafes along Boulevard Saint-Germain. The city felt both strange and familiar. Strange because everything was new, and familiar because this had been her dream since her university days. She rented a small room near campus, simple but warm and cozy. Mornings were for classes, afternoons spent working at a local bookstore. Each night she sat on the balcony, watching the crowds below and thinking of him, the man who had pushed her toward the future, even when his heart hadn't wanted to let go. Though Ethan never wrote, never texted, she felt his presence in every small milestone of this new life. When she found the courage to speak up in class, when she submitted her first manuscript to a publisher, and when she looked into the mirror and no longer saw the girl, abandoned at the altar, but a woman who could choose. 3 months passed, and one day, after a literary seminar, she received a package. No sender. Inside was an old book, 100 Years of Solitude, by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. On the first page, a familiar hand had written, "So you never forget who you are, or why you began." Her hands trembled slightly. Ethan. She didn't know how he found her address, or why he had chosen silence all this time just to send a book, but she understood one thing clearly. No matter how far apart they were, the thread between them had never truly been broken. 1 year later, Manhattan welcomed Harper with a radiant morning. Blue skies, soft breeze, and the first golden light of summer painted the familiar streets. She stepped through the airport glass doors, heart pounding in her chest. In the arrivals lounge, he stood Ethan Marlowe. No flowers, no grand words, just open arms. And she, without hesitation, ran into them, as if, after everything, this was where she truly belonged. Back at the townhouse with him, everything felt familiar. The old fireplace, the worn bookshelves, the perfectly balanced cocoa. But this time, he wasn't just the man who once saved her. He was the man who wanted to walk the rest of the road beside her. "I've waited a year to ask you this, Harper," Ethan said, lowering to one knee. "Will you marry me? Not because I rescued you once, but because I want to choose you every day for the rest of my life." And so, the story that began with heartbreak ended in a quiet vow under the same sky where it all fell apart. This time, not with perfection, but with truth. A love chosen, not owed. A future built, not borrowed.